Wonderful. Before we start, I would like to take a moment to confirm that we will have some time for a Q&A at the end. Please share your questions in the chat. My colleague and our Manager of Education and Outreach, Olivia Luntz, will help to compile them. We will do our best to get through all the questions at the end, but we do appreciate your patience as we compile those questions. As we approach 2026 and the anniversary of the birth of the United States, this presentation today provides an important dialogue on how to reflect on the revolution and its legacy, as well as to better understand how this momentous event really impacted the diverse communities across the New England area. We are exceptionally fortunate to host Dr. Akeia de Barros Gomes as the lead in this presentation today. Her expertise as historian, anthropologist, curator, is really instrumental in examining today's topic on African and Indigenous history. She has recently curated a project called Entwined: Freedom, Sovereignty, and the Sea, a 2024 exhibition at the Mystic Seaport Museum, which delves into the history of the founding and development of New England through Indigenous, African, and African-descended narratives. She now serves as the director of the Center for Black History at the Newport Historical Society, where she leads the development of the Wanton Lyman Hazard House, which will open as an exhibition, education, and community programming space in 2026. She's also a visiting scholar and an adjunct lecturer at Brown University's Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. So we are very, very excited to have you here to join us in this conversation. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Gomes for her presentation.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen, and thank you all for being here on a Saturday to listen to this presentation. Can you see my screen? And it's the full slide? Perfect.
Yes.
Thank you. Perfect. And so really, I'm not going to focus so much on the revolution itself as the concept of freedom making. And I'd really like to use this presentation today to explore how we can use African and Dawnland Indigenous worldviews to reframe the way we think about freedom, dignity, and personhood, and how we can use these concepts to more deeply understand why some Black and Indigenous men fought in the war, knowing that even after the war, they would not realize full freedom. Or to understand perhaps why some Black men chose to join the British instead. But ultimately, how this can help us understand freedom making as this continuous process from the colonial era to the present. And I will say before moving on to the next slide that there are elements of this presentation that focus on Dawnland Indigenous histories and worldview and thought. These are based on knowledge that's been shared with me that I have permission to share, either out of working collaboratively with individuals from tribal nations or out of friendship. But I just want to make clear that I do not speak for any Dawnland Indigenous tribal nation or Indigenous people of the Dawnland as a whole. I'm sharing knowledge that I have permission to share. So just a little bit of my background and sort of why I approach this work the way I do, and how I came to do this work working with African and Dawnland Indigenous communities. I got my start in Connecticut. I'm a Rhode Islander, but I got my start in Connecticut as an archaeologist on the Mashantucket Pequot Reservation. I think having that as a starting point was pretty invaluable because I was learning how to do history that was not my history. I was learning how to do history where the descendant community or the active community gets to be the authoritative voice in the way that histories are interpreted and told. And it very much shaped the way I approach addressing community when doing these histories, and really framing the histories through the voices of African descended, and Indigenous peoples. I went on from Mashantucket to doing field work, first archaeology and then anthropological field work in the Virgin Islands in a Rastafarian community. I then took a job teaching as a college professor for about 10 years. And a big part of that was service learning trips where we'd go for a month or two to various locations around the world. One of those trips was to West Africa, specifically Ghana, Togo, and Benin, where I spent quite a bit of time at Cape Coast, which was a major slave trading port, Ouidah, Benin, which was also a major slave trading port, and Ganvier, Benin, which is, if you don't know about Ganvier, Benin, it is a village or a town that's on the water. Some people call it the Venice of Africa. The reason it exists is, and I'll get into this later when I talk about water and spirituality, the belief about the spiritual components of water was so strong that the people that later inhabited Ganvier knew if they were on the water, that their enemies, the Fon, who were slave raiders, would not engage in that activity on the water because it would be considered, what we would call blasphemy. So that village exists to this day. So all of that to say, I did this, what Rastas in the Virgin Islands told me was a reverse seasoning. If we think about the history of slavery in New England, what typically happened is people were transported from the West African coast to the West Indies to New England. My career has really been the opposite of that, from New England to the West Indies to West Africa. And so that shapes the way that I engage in these histories and tell these histories. So as was mentioned earlier, my last curatorial project was the exhibition Entwined: Freedom, Sovereignty, and the Sea at Mystic Seaport Museum. And the relevance for that in this presentation is we really focused on how did and how do Indigenous and African descended communities define freedom. If freedom is about having the possibility to engage in your human potential to the fullest extent possible, freedom isn't simply the absence of being enslaved or bound out. So you might have your freedom, you might be manumitted, you might not be beholden to any person as an enslaved or indentured person, but if land is still being taken, if you're still subject to racial violence, and you're not afforded equal opportunities to participate in social, political, and economic benefits of society, how do we then frame freedom for Dawnland, Indigenous, and African descended people? And so for my own work with Indigenous people, I've come to understand freedom as always having been about the maintenance of sovereignty, kin, and community. And so through that lens, we can look at Indigenous participation in fighting wars from the time of the revolution to the present in the highest numbers when it comes to so-called racial or ethnic groups. We can see that participation as a step toward freedom making, and not necessarily the abstract concept of total freedom as an individual. Entwined was part of a larger project in collaboration with Brown University and Williams College about challenging the story we tell about the development and founding of New England. So typically the story is told that New England was founded as this place of safety and freedom and justice for all. And the project with Brown University, which was a Mellon-funded project, really wanted to look at New England as a site of colonialism, slavery, and dispossession. But the very first thing that I did as lead curator on this project was work with a group of people from tribal nations from New England and Black communities from New England to say, what's our history and how do we want to tell it? And none of us wanted to focus on stories of colonialism, slavery, and dispossession, because we all felt that our histories are so much more than that. And our histories go back much farther than that. And so what we really came to focus on were a few things I'm going to point out on this slide. And this actually ended up being the narrative from the exhibit. We came up with it on the first day, and it was the thing that guided us throughout the exhibit. And so the first is language. the first two words you see here, Kuta and Kalunga, are our words for the Atlantic Ocean. Using the language, being able to speak using the worldview of your ancestors, there's a lot of freedom in that, right? Not having to subscribe to imposed epistemologies and modes of thought. And we can think about how these things would have shaped notions of freedom. When I asked the group, what is our history and how do we want to tell it? It was something along these lines, right? Kuta Kalunga, which are words, by the way, that are not only about the body of water, even though one word is Pequot and the other word is Bantu, they both have the same connotation. So oceans and waterways aren't just bodies of water for transport or resource extraction. They are places of creation. They are places of rebirth. They are places that hold our histories, and they are places that house our ancestors. And you get that from using those individual words. Whereas if you use Atlantic Ocean, you kind of have to add on words to describe that. And so that's what I meant before when I said being able to use the worldview and language of your ancestors. And so when I said, what's our history and how do we want to tell it? It was really about this ebb and flow of water and our legacies. And what happened when African captives were brought here to Turtle Island or North America and encountered indigenous people. It was about Black and Indigenous histories going back millennia, our historical connections to each other, our ancestors, and our survival. And I'll get into some of these points. You don't have to read all of this, obviously, but I'll get into some of these points on upcoming slides. So we really framed our freedom as much more than fighting against oppressions. It's embedded in all of the things that are being mentioned here. And it's really about centering our histories and our voice and focusing on enduring legacies, strength, and resilience of both African descended peoples and Dawnland Indigenous nations. And so I want to talk a little bit about waterscapes and landscapes and Indigenous concepts of both. I've thrown out the word Dawnland a couple of times, so I just want to, if it's a term that's unfamiliar, or if you're not clear on what that means, we call it the Dawnland. This is the Indigenous term for what we refer to as New England, because if you think about it, living on the East Coast, we're the first to welcome the sun as it comes back to life over the water. So people of the dawn, people of the first light, are many of the actual tribal names of New England tribal nations. And so while we often tend to start Black and Indigenous maritime histories with contact with Europeans or with whaling, and I imagine when people heard Mystic Seaport Museum was doing an exhibit on Black and Indigenous maritime histories, a lot of people thought it was going to be about whaling. Because that's where we tend to start the history. But it's important to acknowledge that there were already maritime histories, cultures, skills, and people for going back over 12,000 years, both here in the Dawnland and throughout sub-Saharan Africa. And so looking specifically at maritime histories and waterways, just fixing our perspective and looking at these things through an Indigenous lens, I think the first thing when it comes to landscapes is being of the land. And so you will often hear people of Dawnland Indigenous tribes saying, we are the land. And so there's a reciprocity, right? There's this freedom in being nourished by the land and then being reciprocal in nourishing the land. There's freedom in being nourished by your relatives, whether those are animals or plant life or other people, and then being reciprocal and returning that nourishment. That is what sustains us. And when I say I don't mean to confuse things when I say us, I'm saying us in general. I am not from an Indigenous tribal nation, so I don't mean it in that way. Some other ways in thinking about freedom and waterscapes and landscapes, wonderful Narragansett scholar, Max Scott, who is also at Brown University, looks at what he calls Machoon Empire. If you look at the picture in the top left there, that is a dugout canoe called a Machoon. It is created, incidentally, in the exact same way dugout canoes are created in West Africa, with one exception. The Akan do not use this method to create their dugout canoes. But rather than digging the tree trunk out with tools, fire and water are used to burn out the canoe until it is perfectly shaped, bug resistant, resistant to leakage and all of that. And so these were used to not only traverse up and down the coast, but also the inland waterways to engage in trade, to engage in warfare, to engage in marriages. So again, that freedom of being able to sustain yourself and your community. And then we can also look at creation stories. And we often hear indigenous, and when I say indigenous, in this case, I mean global, indigenous creation stories as myths or cute children's stories. And we neglect to see the deeply embedded traditional ecological knowledge that is in those creation stories. So for example, one creation story talks about how we are on the back of a turtle, right? North America is Turtle Island. I used that on the previous slide. And there is also, if you haven't seen it, by the way, there is a great exhibit at the Mashantucket Pequot Museum called Our Moons. It's about 13 moons. We're on the back of a turtle, right? If you look at a turtle's back, there are 13 big plates in the center, and then there are 28 plates going around the circumference. 13 and 28, that's a full lunar year, right? 13 cycles of 28. And so the knowledge, right, when I talk about deeply embedded ecological knowledge, if we are on the back of a turtle, of course, it's the back of a turtle that would tell us how to navigate the seasons. So each of the 13 moons has a different name. We are currently in the bear or snow moon, and it gives you warnings. It also tells you what's going on the landscape and tells you how to survive in the environment. And so all of these would have been present as maritime history, maritime culture, maritime navigation and skills prior to European contact. We invented this term for the exhibit, duskland, to refer to the west coast of Africa. And so we can also look there for land and waterscapes before America. And so we really wanted to use that term to show the connections between Africa and the Dawnland. One group saying hello to greet the sun in the morning, and then the other side of the globe saying good night to the sun. If you look at this slide, what you're seeing on the right-hand side there is a naval battle that was captured by some explorers in the early 19th century, right? And there's also this fabulous book that I would definitely recommend, Undercurrents of Power, Aquaculture in the African Diaspora, that looks at this millennia-old maritime culture and tradition on the African continent, and that is spread out through the diaspora. It's called aquatic culture rather than maritime culture or maritime history, because the author Kevin Dawson makes the point that when we use maritime history, we're usually talking about people who didn't get in the water, but Africans did get in the water, and that's a primary part of African diaspora maritime histories and cultures. And so the book looks at things like swimming. And again, Dr. Dawson points out that during the transatlantic slave trade and prior to it, most Europeans actually could not swim. Many enslaved Africans were enslaved to swim, to deep sea dive for shipwrecks, to build boats, etc., because almost all Africans could swim. The surfing culture that existed on both African coasts, East and West Coast. So you can actually see a little bit of that on the cover of Dr. Dawson's book, where if you've ever been to the West Coast of Africa, the tides are pretty treacherous right up to the coast. It's not water where you would just jump in and swim. And so you literally had to surf your canoes over the water to get out to the deep sea to fish. And then later do the same thing to get out to slave ships. And again, those dugout canoes that were constructed using fire and water. And actually on both sides, right, here and in West Africa, the thinking is you're using the four elements. So the tree represents earth. You're using fire to burn out the dugout canoe. You're using water to regulate it. And the wind or the air is what keeps the fire going. And so these last two slides really highlight those aquatic maritime traditions that existed before there was even an America. I titled this side Spiritual Waterscapes, but I just want to put an asterisk there. There really is no distinct line, and whether we're talking about African or Dawnland Indigenous, there is no distinct line between spiritual and everyday or spiritual and secular. Everything is spiritual, but spirituality is also very practical, right? But looking at waterscapes and water in general, water is seen as life. Water is also seen as divinely feminine. And I'll explain why in a second. This in particular is a sub-Saharan African envisioning of the universe on the left. And this would hold true for the most part for indigenous tribal nations here as well. Despite what colonists and colonizers would say about Africans and indigenous people here being heathenish or believing in multiple gods, both have a concept of a single creator. I think the primary difference and maybe where the misunderstanding came from is the thinking is that creator is really, really busy upholding the entire universe and everything in it. So you would never go to that creator directly with our petty human problems, right? The creator gave us the gift of ancestors and divinities, which might be features in nature, things like that. Those are our messengers to the creator, right? But I just wanted to make that point that on both sides of the Atlantic, there was this concept of a single creator. And here's how water and waterways and waterscapes come in. If you look to the right, this is a Bakongo cosmogram. I used to teach a course on African spirituality and would spend about a week just on this image because it is literally an envisioning of the entire universe and everything in it. It looks at time as circular or cyclical. So if you look at the arrows on the outside, that is the movement of time. That is also our life cycle. That is also the movement of the sun and the moon. The horizontal line going across is the Kalunga, literally the water or waterways or ocean. On the very top where it says Takula, that is considered sort of divine masculine space. If you go to the bottom where it says Musoni, that is divine feminine space. The dot that says Kala all the way to the right represents the precise moment of birth. So birth, you go up to Takula, and I'll use my cursor, birth, life, death, ancestorhood, right? And rebirth. So this isn't only our life cycle. This is the sun coming up, peaking at noon, going to bed at night. And just like our ancestors, when the sun goes away, we know it's coming back, right? It's still sustaining us. It's still present. Same with the moon, right? These can also represent the different phases of life. So really, really complicated imagery, but hopefully that brief explanation, I don't have a week to go over it with you. So hopefully that brief explanation was good enough. This word here, Mpemba, means ancestors. So again, earlier when I said Kuta and Kalunga imply a place that our ancestors reside, this is literally indicating that, where Nseke means our plane of existence. The reason that I have these two images here, so this is actually a picture of one of my ancestors, incidentally, who was on a boat out in the deep ocean. He was a whaler. He worked at sea. This place within the Kalunga is not only a place of ancestors, but it's a place of conception. And so I've heard it both here in the Dawnland and in West Africa, that the water of the Kalunga or the water of the ocean or the water of the river is no different than the water in a woman's womb. They are both places of creation. And so I have this particular picture here of my ancestor and this picture here because something very significant, again, on both sides of the Atlantic, my own son was born on the same day as this ancestor, right? And in African spirituality, the way we think about water and ancestors, that is pretty significant. And so again, life cycles, time cycles, water is central to that. And there is a Bakongo proverb that the river is constant, right? The ocean is constant, the waterway is constant, and everything else moves in the framework of that river. And so that's what you're seeing in this image here. If you understand the cosmogram, it makes some stories and histories start to make sense, at least the way Africans and African descended people have perceived these stories. So if you're not familiar with the story of Igbo landing in the South Carolina Sea Islands, very briefly, it is a story about a slave ship that was transporting enslaved people to South Carolina. And the enslaved people got off of the boat in chains. They knew what was ahead for them. And so they turned around and they walked right back in the water. And they are said to have chanted as they were walking into the water brought us here, the water will bring us home. Typically, that has been framed as a mass suicide. But if you look at it in the context of this, right, through an African lens, through African worldview, returning home means going back and joining your ancestors, right? And so the flying home or the going home or the returning home is literally crossing the waters or going into the Kalunga. And it also, incidentally, you know, when we think about the stories of Africans that jumped overboard during the Middle Passage, that is always framed as a suicide, that they would prefer death to being enslaved. But again, if the worldview or if the thinking is based on this concept of circular time and cycles in the Kalunga, it's a rebirth, not a death when you jump into the water. And so again, really, really a key element of African concepts of waterscapes. And so what does all of this have to do with freedom and freedom making? Again, because freedom isn't this fixed point where you ever achieve total freedom. I just participated in the opening of a reception at the Smithsonian called In Slavery's Wake, where the Simmons Center at Brown University is part of this global curatorial project that looks at freedom making in all of these areas that were important points in the transatlantic slave trade. So Africatown in Alabama, Rio de Janeiro, Cape Town in South Africa, Dakar in Senegal, and Liverpool, looking at the ways descendants of enslaved people have always made freedom and engaged in that process of freedom making. But again, not as a single destination or a single moment, but as this ongoing set of practices. Because again, even after emancipation, dignity, freedom of movement, and physical safety were still things that were threatened. So we can look at things like, and I was part of a panel discussion that dealt with this document last weekend, a 1779 petition to the New Hampshire government written by Black men that says things like freedom is an inherent right of the human species, and that they were conscious of the dignity, the equal dignity of human nature. So we can begin to look at what were the African concepts of freedom and dignity that enslaved men retained, either as cultural baggage or the ways of seeing the world, but what were those concepts that shaped freedom making and thinking about freedom? One important concept is this. And this is important when we think about fighting in the revolution, fighting in the war, although not achieving complete freedom for oneself. The African concept that conflict and contradiction is the order of the day. And again, this is something that is spiritual and also practical. So if we live in a universe where conflict is always going on, contradiction is our state of existence, and our goal is to always act to try to balance that out, that would have been something that Black men fighting in the war would have carried with them, right? So again, those cycles of conflict and contradiction, our role is to try to mitigate those or balance those. And if any of you have ever read the book, The Famished Road by Ben Okri, he says this quite beautifully when he says, from a certain point of view, the universe seems to be composed of paradoxes, but everything resolves. That is the function of contradiction. And so this is a really, really important concept in African worldview, and absolutely would have shaped the way Black men fighting in the revolution would have seen that conflict. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about work that I am doing now that is directly related to all of this. I am currently, as was said earlier, the director of the Center for Black History that will be located in this home, the Wanton Lyman Hazard House, which is, we believe, the oldest remaining house in Newport, Rhode Island. We know that there were 4 enslaved individuals that lived within this house. And for that and some other reasons, it was really important that this become a site of Black history in the house. What you're looking at below is a 1743 tax document where John G. Wanton, who was the owner of the house, is listed as having 1 slave, right? They're tallying up his property to see how much he should pay in taxes. And he has 1 slave. And so that's being documented there. We know that the enslaved person in the household was a man named Cardardo Wanton, because about 20 years later, in September of 1775, we have this document where John Wanton is saying, Cardardo, I do release and discharge him, the said Negro man, from the state of slavery. So he's manumitting Cardardo, but, red flag, right? But said Negro hath for some time past been much addicted to the excessive use of strong liquors, so as to render him incapable of taking due care of himself. Therefore, I reserve unto myself the care and government over him as guardian, right? And so again, you have Cardardo being legally freed, but then John Wanton is saying, but he can't take care of himself. So I'm going to stay on as his guardian. And then he makes sure to say at the end of the document, and Cardardo can't inherit anything from me when I die. And so, you know, again, this is September 1775. And it's a head scratcher, right? What's going on here? Is this a document that actually frees Cardardo? And so if you look a few months before this, here's some, I don't know if this gives us more questions or actually answers why this is phrased in this way. So May 1775, this is a document from the Society of Friends, because John Wanton was actually a Quaker and was not supposed to hold people in slavery. And so this document is actually the Society of Friends listing every member of the society that refuses to manumit slaves or isn't listening to them when they're saying, you need to free the people you enslave. And so John Wanton likewise refuses to comply with said advice. And then they say, we're going to deal with that at the next meeting. The next meeting was supposed to be in July or August, but for some reason, it was supposed to be in July, sorry, and for some reason got pushed until August. And then in September, we have this document where Cardardo is being freed, but John Wanton is saying, but I'm going to act as his guardian because he can't take care of himself. So, you know, just putting ourselves into the mind of Cardardo, he probably didn't feel very free, right? And just to put a finer point on this document, the Quakers, after they get done with John Wanton, they then list all of the people that they're kicking out of the society because they have refused to manumit the people they enslave. And the other thing, I guess I should put in there is, this is also a time period where there is all of this revolutionary rhetoric going on about freedom from oppression and being enslaved by the British. And I'm sure Cardardo is hearing that and thinking about it in terms of his own freedom. But there was a problem with that, right? Particularly in Newport, which was the capital of the American slave trade. So even well-to-do Quakers, even people who, like John Wanton, talked about how slavery was morally reprehensible, and that's why he's manumitting Cardardo. The entire economy of Newport, right? The wealth of Newport, and most of the prominent individuals who lived in Newport were engaged in the slave trade in one way or another. and about half of all houses in Newport had individuals in them who were enslaved. And the reason, oops, let me go back. The reason I wanted to bring up Cardardo here is a couple of years later, he also enlists to fight in the Revolutionary War. And if you see here, it's on a secret expedition under the command of Colonel George Williams. There is this folklore in Newport that perhaps the phrasing of Cardardo being addicted to excessive liquors was really just a way for him to be able to be used as a spy on the British. Not sure where that folklore comes from or where it originated, or if it's just a way of saying, hey, John Wanton wasn't a bad guy, right? He was going along with this ruse to fight for American freedom. We don't know, but I think it would be really cool if it was a true story. And then in 2005, in the Wanton Lyman Hazard House, which is there on the lower left, this item that you're seeing on the screen was discovered under attic floorboards. And it tells us a lot about Cardardo. We are dating this to the time period of Cardardo's enslavement because of the date of the fabric. He would have been the only person enslaved in the household. And so I will get into some detail about what this belonging means, but it really is this creative adaptation of an African practice that Cardardo integrated into his own belief system, spirituality, concepts of freedom, etc. And so thinking about freedom making as agency, creativity, and humanity, right? The freedom to insist upon your humanity when you are living in a system that defines you as property, right? In all documents, in the way you are treated, you are someone's personal property. And so when we look at agency, creativity, and humanity, these are the things that enabled Black and Indigenous people to survive colonialism, slavery, and dispossession. And I'll explain what this means on an upcoming slide, but thinking about the freedom of our ancestors to be both novel and resonant. And again, mirroring the movement of water or the oceans, thinking about the ebb and flow of creating identity, right, which is a certain type of freedom. So we often hear that the Middle Passage was a social death. The African died and something new was created. The ebb and flow of creating that new identity, the erosion of the old identity, the maintenance of some parts of the old identity, right? All of this is involved in that agency, creativity, and humanity. So I want to talk a little bit about what this bundle actually is and represents. We call it an Nkisi bundle, Nkisi. And the bundle itself is actually in the exhibit at Mystic Seaport. It has a very important story to tell, so we borrowed it for that exhibit. The figure that you see on the right is an Nkisi. We see these all over sub-Saharan Africa, and they go by different names. This would be from the Congo region. And Nkisi is a figure that helps with that concept of reciprocity. So if you are giving prayer or an offering or asking for guidance from an ancestor, right, you might pour some water into the ground as a return, right, that reciprocity. But this is really something physical you can use to direct your prayers. Sometimes Nkisi are embedded with beads. They can be embedded with cowrie shells, with broken glass, with animal bones, with pottery, with hair, right? All of these are very symbolic in different ways. And hammering or striking an Nkisi with a nail is what breathes life into your prayer, or it's called ashe, breath or life. And so actually what Cardardo was doing when he created this bundle was very creatively replicating this Nkisi on the right, which he absolutely could not do in a Christian household, right? He created this bundle which he could keep hidden under the floorboard and maintain elements of this African practice. And of note, If you look towards the top, there's actually a cowrie shell within the Nkisi bundle. So somehow, someone, some way, got that Nkisi shell from Africa to Newport, and Cardaro chose to use it in this bundle. And so again, this brings us back to thinking about freedom making as both novelty and resonance. Freedom and survival through being creative and making something new, right? And that's the novelty, but also relying on knowledge and skills of your ancestors that's been passed down to you, and that's the resonance. And that in and of itself would have been recognized as a conflict or a contradiction between the old and the new. But again, that's the order of the day. It's our job to figure out how to manage those contradictions and that conflict. And here I'm quoting Stephanie Smallwood, who wrote Saltwater Slavery, when she talks about this identity formation and this freedom and this agency. She says, only through the capacity and willingness to invent and experiment, to grow and change the cultural tools carried in memory, and create new ones to meet the demands of this new world, could Africans hope to remain recognizable to themselves as human beings in a system that held so much of their humanity in callous and calculated disregard, right? So that insistence upon your humanity when everything in society is insisting upon your status as property. And so this would have, these practices like having the bundle, remembering language, remembering drumming, remembering dances and chants, would have been used for things like reasserting a healthy relationship to ancestors, even though you're physically removed from the land of your ancestors, managing death, whether that's death from sickness, death from conflict, but really coming up with a system of spirituality that helps you navigate that, again, outside of the home of your ancestors, being able to produce social networks, community, and kinship in a system where, any of that could be taken away at any time. So if you're enslaved, you could be sold, your children could be sold, the people you make friends and relationships with could be sold. And so how do you navigate that? To address the imbalance of power between Black and white. And again, to stake a claim to your body as human, counter to the slave economy's claim that you are property to be owned. And so this novelty and resonance, this freedom making, was all in the context of what I have on this slide, right? Agency and creativity in order to create those relationships, not only here, right, between community members, but between yourself and your ancestors. The presentation I gave last Sunday, or moderated last Sunday, was about how African worldviews and perspectives would have shaped the thoughts about freedom and human dignity for those who fought in the revolution. And from my point of view, my training in anthropologist taught me about this thing, cultural baggage, that when I traveled to these different locations, as open-minded as you want to be, right, as open to new ideas as you want to be, there are so many things we take for granted because of our culture and because of our upbringing, things we don't even question that we carry with us. And so we talked about in this panel discussion how those elements of African culture, language, seeing the world, would have been carried, particularly among enslaved Black men, but also free Black men who would have fought in the revolution. And so really, looking at this persistence of memory, persistence of identity, even if you think you've risen above it, right, or changed the way you see the world. And so this is actually, this image is from a documentary called The Language You Cry In, which really illustrates the depth of the persistence of memory and identity. And it is a documentary about a linguistic anthropologist that is in the South Carolina Sea Island, same place where the Ebo landing enslaved people walked into the water. And this very elderly woman is singing a song, bouncing a little baby on her knee. And when they ask her what she's singing, she says, "Oh, I don't know, it's just nonsense words. It's something my mother used to sing to me when I was little." It's something her mother used to sing to her when she was little. And spoiler alert, what you find out at the end of the documentary is that word for word, with precise rhythm, without skipping a beat or misstating a word, it is a song from Sierra Leone that tribal people used to sing as people were being carried away as captives. And it's a mourning song about, you'll die, but we'll see you again, you will return. And so I think this picture is right after the moment when the woman from South Carolina goes into a village and she sings the song, and the people of the village start screaming and crying because it's the song come to life, right? It's this song about you're being taken away, but we know you'll be back with us. And so for hundreds of years, her family maintained that song, even though they didn't know they were maintaining it, right? And so it can be frustrating as a scholar, not knowing that those things have been retained, but it's sort of comforting, right? If you think about the fact that you are carrying things from your ancestors that have helped you survive and you don't even know it. And so this statement, "We are still here," is of particular relevance for members of sovereign tribal nations, of course, but I wanted to end here as an overall statement that recognizing our presence and our contribution in what is American is important. Indigenous nations are still present. African descendants are reclaiming our roots. We are understanding our paths and how both Dawnland Indigenous and African descended people maintain themselves through both novelty and resonance, right? So this idea of traditional having to mean the way things were done 300, 400 years ago is kind of nonsense. We can understand the relationship to landscapes and waterscapes and the history and agency involved in personal choice, such as the choice to fight in a war for freedom when you know those around you were still enslaved. And even if you were successful in your endeavor, you would not see full freedom. And I work toward the goal of both scholars and those outside of Black and Indigenous communities, and sometimes in Black and Indigenous communities, to begin to understand some of these things through Dawnland and African perspectives, rather than the way we've traditionally been taught this history. So I will end it there, and thank you all for listening to me. And I am happy to take any questions or comments.
So if anybody has any questions, please pull it into the chat and we'll start talking about them.
I think people have hands up. That maybe it's easier to talk than to write it in the chat.
Yeah, I have been able to see the hands. I'm not seeing hands on my end.
The one, David Hoskins and Myra Klockenbranken. I'm sorry, Myra, if I mispronounced your name.
Go ahead, Myra. Go ahead, Myra.
David, I think I couldn't put in the chat. Just how moving your presentation was.
Oh, thank you.
How necessary it is for us to hear it. This is, you know, this is such valuable knowledge that we all need to know, not only anthropologically, but personally. You know, for myself, you have to decide where you're going to put your energy. And so where I put my energy, my lifelong, has been into working to preserve and restore our environment, keep what we can, and And recognized at the time I made that choice. It was an early choice that I was sort of, in a way, choosing between working for the environment or working for people, putting myself in service of people. But what you've really done here is demonstrate how they're the same. They're really just the same. And the other thing, I'm sorry, but the other thing that really came to me in this is that you talk about how this is the culture that they carried forward. They're where you are in this culture, and we are in ours, locked within it in a way, enslaved by our own culture. And we're having to figure out how to make freedom within that inheritance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Myra.
We do have a question in the chat.
Oh, David, sorry, David had his hand
I was
up
about to
before,
say,
so I don't want to forget about him.
I gladly defer to that written question. No problem. I'm fine.
No, please do.
Well, I was thinking as you're speaking, I'm thinking that in a word, it's all about connection. You described it as part of a circle, but the components are connected to each other. And the Surgeon General of the United States under various presidents, Dr. Murty, said that loneliness is an epidemic, and one way to describe loneliness is the lack of connections, and that includes to something that Myra was also saying. You can work. Solitude is not loneliness if you are connected to your ancestors, to something greater than yourself, and so forth. And I don't mean to get too deep or philosophical, but I'm an older retired guy right now, and I look around and try to pay attention to things, and it comes through and through and through, and that is, I don't know my ancestors. You're talking about culture and so forth. I have no idea what my Bulgarian great-grandfather was like. I have nothing in me that relates. So we're untethered. So anyway, just random thoughts.
Thank you.
So we have a question in the chat. Can you speak to how and where African cultural experiences were kept alive in New England?
Yeah, I can answer it, but I will also say that's difficult to answer, right? For a couple of reasons. If we're looking at the archival record, no one thought it was important enough to document, right? So again, what you typically see is people of African descent being listed as property, and that's the primary way you see us in archival records, either that or punishments or advertisements or runaway ads, right? But we do know about the Negro election days for Negro governors and Negro kings, which happened throughout New England. And when you read the descriptions, it becomes kind of clear that things like maintenance of language, knowledge of drumming, knowledge of dancing, knowledge of Africa went a long way. And if you look at communities like here in Newport, people who were from Africa who maintained an African tongue, who knew and could talk about the history of Africa, were people that were held in very high regard. The other reason, so it's not just the lack of documentation. The other reason it's very difficult to be able to find these things is when they were going on, they needed to be hidden. So the bundle just happened to be discovered by chance. It was hidden under a floorboard. It was never meant to be seen. Why? Because Cardarta was supposed to be Christian, right? And the amazing thing about African spirituality is you can engage in African spirituality and incorporate concepts
Yes or no?
You can incorporate concepts of Christianity, and that's not seen as like blasphemous or a bad thing to do, because most indigenous spiritualities are very open and inclusive. And so the thinking is, I don't know everything, so why would I reject Jesus, right? As Jesus is powerful and kissy, why would I reject that just because it's not something I knew before, right? And that's where that creativity and adaptation come in. You could do that from the perspective of African spirituality, but it doesn't work the other way. You don't get to be Christian and practice African spirituality too. And so unlike places in the American South, in the West Indies, in Latin America, throughout the diaspora, where these traditions like Santeria and Voodoo and Candomblé emerged, where you're seeing this, and when I say syncretism, I don't mean it to be like this equal thing, but you see this syncretism of Catholicism or Christianity with African spirituality, and that becomes the spirituality here. You don't see that here in New England. So the assumption has always been people were Christianized and they just got rid of their African spirituality. But we know that's not true because we have tangible evidence of that in the bundle. We have a Black Christianity, even in New England, that focuses on Old Testament and resistance songs and water and things like that, that would have been really important in African spirituality. And even though the bundle from the Wantmime and Hazard House is the only one that's been identified, there is a reference to another one in Deerfield, Mass, a woman named Jenny Cole, who was enslaved by the Reverend of Deerfield, Mass. They noted how she would collect like buttons and shells and all of these odds and ends. And when they asked her why she was doing it, she said so she would have these things to bring home. Them not understanding African spirituality, they thought she was going back to Africa and she would be able to show off this wealth she got in the United States. But really, again, going home means returning to the water, or what we would think of as death. So she was collecting these things to bring to her ancestors when she returned home. And she also passed this practice down because when her son died, it was discovered that he also had a bundle. And so these are some clues, right, that this spirituality was maintained, even though it's much more difficult for us in New England to be able to identify it.
Thank you. We do have a two-parter question. We have somebody, for those who live in Greenwich, are there more local resources you recommend that we explore? And also, he's a scout leader. Are there resources that he can use to share knowledge like this with his diverse scout troop? So twofold.
The Greenwich question, I should probably leave to you who are at the Greenwich Historical Society, because I'm not so familiar with the history of Greenwich, so I wouldn't presume to speak on that or what resources about your local area. I'd say as far as resources, I could certainly, I can put my email in the chat and I can send you a list of resources rather than trying to rattle them off and have you furiously write them down. I'm gonna put my email here.
And this recording will be available, yes?
Yes,
Yeah.
I'm speaking for you, but I was assuming so.
Yes, it will be available, yes.
I'm going to jump in here too, since and say a couple of things. Number one, Akeia, thank you for, as an Afro-Indigenous descendant in Greenwich and Westchester, Dutchess, everywhere is where my folks have always been. I thank you for speaking about our humanity as people and our worldview, specifically about spirituality and it's so important. Everybody knows me as a genealogist and a family historian, but I'm sitting here in my art studio. I'm also an artist. And when I so I'm speaking to you now as an artist. And I actually, when I saw the Congo cosmogram, all of the spirituality I put in my own artwork, and I was going to share, if I'm allowed to share, one of my Blessed Be Byram, so you can see what you just discovered, you just discussed. So can I do that for a quick second? Or I can't? Anyways, I can try to put it in can I send you the picture to put in the chat?
Yeah, we can
Because
try to put it in the
you
chat.
see all of these, you spoke so brilliantly about the relationship we have to land, to water, to ancestors. And when I was raised, I always tell people we were raised culturally a little bit different because our ancestors are with us all the time. There is no separation. And it's very hard when I'm put in situations as a descendant and people don't get how important that is as a descendant, that people recognize that there's no separation, and we are because they were. But I can also give Lauren a more in-depth bibliography that talks about these things that are specific to Greenwich, and it was wonderful presentation.
Thank you. Thanks. And you pointed out, Teresa, I've had a lot of, as much as I love the exhibit that the community created at Mystic Seaport, when I do tours, I often stumble because there are just things that you cannot articulate, right? When you're talking about ancestors, and even when you're talking about concepts of gender, when you're talking about the creator as neither male or female and divinities as neither male or female, but then you're talking about the water as divine feminine space, right? It's really difficult in the English language to share some of those ideas. So I feel you there. It can be tough.
It's true.
Yeah. So
and I have your email, so I'll email it to you. So don't worry about it.
Great.
We have
Thank
plenty
you.
of time for more questions too, so we'll try and get through a few more. We have a question on how many free and escaped slaves served in the Continental Army and the British Army.
Ooh, that's a big don't know. I could look that up, but I don't know that number offhand.
That's a nebulous number depending on the sources.
I would just add, since I'm a daughter of color, you're talking, if you are using DAR numbers, it's anywhere right now, they estimate from 5,000 to 8,000, and that is according to the documents. If you're talking about Black loyalists, because I have Black patriots and Black loyalists, the numbers that you see in the Book of Negroes are highly below. And I always have to remind people that those were the people who were allowed to get on the ship. Okay, we do not know how many Black loyalists were walked across the border, not only to Nova Scotia, but through Quebec, Ontario, which was better. So that number is way over 3,000. So always look at the Book of Negroes as just the lower end, because then again, we don't even know how many Black loyalists were put on ships and sent to the Bahamas or sent elsewhere as well. So that number, we have no idea.
We have another question that says, can you share any additional advice for how to do history if it's not your history in ways that are respectful? Which I think is an excellent question. If you can
that's a great question. So I can use, even though I was already working with communities, I can use the exhibit, the way we went about doing the exhibit, as an example. I would say if you have a particular project that you are working on and you need Black or Indigenous voices to be part of that project, this sounds very counterintuitive, but table that project and build a relationship with those communities or the appropriate person in those communities. Really important when you're dealing with tribal nations, because there are particular people who have authority to talk about history and culture, to represent the tribal group. You can speak to anyone as an individual for their reflections on their identity. But if you really want to say, I worked with this tribe, it should be through proper protocol, and speaking with the proper people. But the worst thing you can do, I'm not speaking for anyone but myself and my own experience, the worst thing you can do is go into a community and say, I have a project dealing with your community's history. Can you help me with it? Right? That project shouldn't be as important as the relationship with that group, and making sure that you are clear that the relationship isn't a one and done, that it will survive or outlive the project. And so, I gave the example of getting my start at the Mashantucket Pequot Reservation. I currently still have relationships with tribal members and individuals in tribal government. And that's not because of projects, that's because of me showing up to powwows, showing up to book talks, showing up to, birthday parties or events, right? Saying I'm a friend and I care about this community, and it's not about me writing about your history to publish in some journal. And that takes a lot longer, right? But what I often hear people say is, well, I reached out to this tribe. I reached out to the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, and they're not getting back to me. First of all, they're probably not getting back to you because there's so much going on, right? But also, it is very clear when you're reaching out and saying, I need an Indigenous person to help me with this project. Will you help me with this project? And so relationship building, I think, is first and foremost. And that might mean it takes you 3, 4, 5 years to finish your project, but at least you will have that representation, that voice, and you get pretty great friendships and relationships out of working in that way. And it's very reciprocal, right? So when I first started at Mystic Seaport, I actually sent an email to someone at Mashantucket who works in tribal government. And I said, I'm so indebted to the tribe for teaching me how to do this history the right way. And that person responded and said, you are not indebted, because look at you now coming back to work in the community with all the knowledge you've gained along the way. That's what it's all about. That's reciprocity, right? And so that's the way to build those relationships. And again, I'm looking at it even as you helped me with my work and shape who I am as a historian. But from an Indigenous perspective, I came back to do work with the community 20 years later, right? So that's that reciprocity and that relationship building that's long-term. And so I know that's not a quick and easy answer, but relationship building is always the first step in engaging in doing work with history or culture in communities that are not your own. They need to trust you. And you need to be cognizant that there are some things that are going to be shared with you that you are asked not to share. Maybe if you're trusted that much, there are going to be things that you're told it's okay to share. There are going to be things that you're not going to be told because you're not a member of the community and that knowledge is not for you, and that has to be okay. And so I think, it's much more complicated than the way we're taught to do history at college and university, but it is the only way I have been able to be successful in working in Indigenous communities and Black communities too.
I think we have time for one more question, and we have a question that is, how do you define or consider freedom within a framework of systemic racism? Another big question.
Big question, right?
Big question.
But I think I have a simple-ish answer. Again, I wouldn't use freedom because it's such an abstraction, right? And that's why throughout the presentation, I used freedom making. So that movement towards recognizing full human potential, that movement towards what we would conceive of as equality, but everyone defines equality differently too, right? But it's that movement towards liberation and realizing full human potential, which, as David said earlier, is about connections, right? So we tend to frame it as I as an individual am free. I'm free to vote. I am free to buy what I want. But that has nothing to do with other people, right? So if freedom was framed as in, I am taking care of everyone, and this is why I love the Indigenous concept of all our relations. I am taking care of all of my relations in this reciprocal, nourishing way. And so I wouldn't define freedom, I would define freedom making. And I'm sorry that doesn't answer your question, right? But I don't see freedom as a real concrete term, but I see freedom making as very concrete. And there's this doctor, he passed away a few years ago, but he was at Harvard, I think Harvard, Paul Farmer, who had this crazy idea to build the best hospitals in the world, in the poorest countries in the world, because he believes health is a human right. And people criticized him, like, building this hospital in Rwanda and building this hospital in Haiti, you're not going to fix the problems of the world, and you're not even going to fix what's going on in Haiti. And his response was, we will never get to utopia, but isn't moving away from dystopia worth it, right? Making those moves. So I think of freedom making in that same way. It's not with the goal of achieving this absolute freedom. It's about learning how to continue to make freedom along the way. So I hope that answers the question somewhat.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful way to wrap up. Thank you so much for joining us for this presentation. We really appreciate it.
Thank all of you, and thank you for engaging in all of your questions. This was great.
Yeah, we've had some wonderful questions. Yes, thank you. All right. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, everyone, and hopefully we'll see you at the Greenwich Historical Society again soon. Thank you.
Thanks. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Have a nice day.